All right, so the first thing that I want to talk about a little bit is just this first essay prompt, right? So this is the first essay that we're going to be writing this semester, and you should all be able to see a copy of the essay prompt in Canvas this week, right? We're going to be working on this essay starting just in chunks, right? And so we already started, like the reading process, and this is true for every essay that we write this semester. The readings are starting to build different ideas. One of the things that I really love about Canvas is being able to have the discussions. The reason that I ask the questions that I do in the discussion posts and kind of ask a lot of those follow-up questions, and Chris is doing the same and you're doing the same for each other, is because think about the discussions this semester as little idea seeds that you're kind of planting, right? And that all of the ideas that you bring out in your discussions, especially like as we move into future assignments, and I ask some more like kind of involved, developed questions relating to the readings, all of those different ideas in the discussions are ideas that you're able to use in your essays. And basically, like, I'm asking you questions and kind of giving you things to write about in the discussions that will, good morning, that will help fuel your ideas for your essay. So that means that what's a really helpful strategy is, in this essay or in future essays, is to go back and look at some of the things that were talked about in the discussions, and you can be like, oh, here's an idea that I have that could be a body paragraph, right? Or here's an idea that I have that I want to explore a little bit farther. And so you're not plagiarizing or taking ideas from, from a place that they shouldn't be involved in your essay. It's quite the opposite, right? Because a lot of times people will ask me, am I allowed to use the ideas from the discussion posts in my essay? You're supposed to, right? I mean, you don't have to, but the whole point of doing the discussion is to build ideas that later on you can use in your essay. So that's kind of how we're going to continue to build. So we started last week with these readings. This week, I'm giving you the essay prompt, and we're going to be working on the introduction, kind of thinking about what is it that you want to say about these things that are influential in your educational journey. And then by next week, we're diving in deep with body paragraphs and working through the essay. The essay won't be due until, I'll probably make it due just because next Monday is a holiday, right? So I'll give you in through that holiday. And then what I'll do is I'll probably launch the module Monday night instead of Sunday night. I'll post a reminder of this on Canvas with everything with the due date. And then whenever we have a holiday in that week, I know that we're not meeting face-to-face for classes, but I factor that holiday into the amount of work that I'm giving you for that week, right? So I just feel like, okay, this way, if you have to work or you have some extra time on a 3-day weekend, if you want to use that time to work on your essay, fantastic. If you want to have it done before then, that's great too. But I'll give you through Monday to turn it in instead of Sunday night. But then also in that week, I'll count that week as like a 4-day week. So I'm not going to give you 5 days worth of work. You'll still be able to kind of factor in that holiday. So that's how I'll do anytime that we have any kind of break, is that I'll give like lighter work that week, but then also I always try to extend those due dates out, because I know for some people just having that extra little bit of time, some people want to work during their holiday. Some people, it's not really much of a holiday if we're kind of just hanging out at home a lot, right? Like, you want to use that extra time. It's totally up to you. So I'm going to share my screen really quick and we'll look through the essay prompt. So every time I give you an essay for this class, right, you'll have a prompt, and the prompt just breaks down exactly what's required of the assignment, kind of gives a little bit of a background, moves into the directions of the assignment, and then talks a little bit about like what are some of the keys to success for the assignment. In addition to the essay prompt, one of the things that I'll post in Canvas next week is the grading rubric. And the grading rubric is the tool that I use when I'm grading essays. For this class, anytime that you write an essay and you submit the essay, it's turned in on time, graded, and you're not either satisfied with your grade or feel like you could revise some things or tweak some things in your essay and turn it into the grade you want, you're welcome to do that, right? And so I think that's really important, because I feel like the learning process is not one where you do something and then it's final, right? I mean, like, we're constantly adjusting, right? Like, as I'm learning to cook, there's things that I cook that taste good. There's things that I fail at, but then I try it again and I learn from that experience. And I think that's true of everything that we're learning. And so I think that, like, this should be no different. Sometimes school, like, forgets that process, right? Forgets how important, failure or difficulty can be in the learning process, right? But what I've always had an issue with is, let's say, for example, I've written a paper in the very beginning. I've gotten an F on that first paper. That paper was one of 5 papers that I turned in a semester, and it really hurt my final grade. The way I see it is that, like, well, of course, in the early on papers, like, it might be a little more difficult. And I've had experiences where, like, I've written papers that weren't strong as I wanted them to be. And then by the end of the semester, I was writing A papers and I still earned like a B in the class. Like, this will be the opposite, right? This will be one of those situations where, let's say, for example, someone wrote the first paper and got a C on it or got a D on it or even got an F on it, right? And they like, you know what, I missed part of the assignment. I could have done better with this assignment for whatever different reason. We can meet, we can talk through the assignment. I'll talk through your paper with you, and then you can revise your paper and turn it in again. And turn it in again, then your grade can only go up, right? But you can turn it in again, and you can take a C paper and turn it into an A paper, and then I'll just replace your grade on Canvas, and it just goes from there. So I really want you to kind of approach this semester with, like, we're practicing a skill, but it's in a low stakes environment, right? And so that's really important that, like, Kristen and I are both here to be able to meet with you to talk about the revisions of your assignment. And I hope that like, for a lot of people, especially as I was reading through the student information sheets, like, there's a lot of apprehension. And I felt the very same way when I took my first English class about, like, I'm nervous as a writer. It's something that I was kind of internalized a lot of these ideas that I picked up in high school about, like, I'm not good at writing, I'm not good at math. And with that came a lot of anxiety when I wrote papers. And so my hope is it's low stakes, right? Turn your paper in, work through them in your best of your ability. Like, we'll work through them leading up, or help you revise the paper before you turn it in. Even I can grade your paper before it's due, kind of give you an idea of where you are. But if you don't hit the mark that you wanted to hit, no problem. We can work through it again, right? Just like any other learning process. Not everything you're going to do is going to be like exactly where you want it to be in the beginning, nor should it be. Like, we leave ourselves room for growth. And I think that's really important that I reflect that in the way that I grade the papers too. Any questions at all about that, just in general? All right, so quick background on this essay, right? We read Sherman Alexie's Superman and Me, and we also read Phuc Tran's prologue and kind of beginning of Saigon, right? And so in those two pieces, they really talk about how important educational artifacts things were in their lives, right? Like with Alexie, we can think about like how important his dad was and his dad's love for reading. We can think about how important comic books were, right, for his educational journey to really creating this situation where he was able to break free of his environment. We see the same thing with Tran, right? The example of the book that he used in the collection of literature was really important to him, and how he was able to use all of these different books as kind of a model for what he wanted to accomplish, as a learner in a new country. He also really talks about like how important music was, how important like changing style was, how important all of these different things were in his path. And so I think that all of us carry that with us, right? That there's things, there's people, there's experiences along the way that are tremendously influential in driving our desire to pursue an education, right? And so for this essay, you're going to be exploring artifacts that are important to you and your own personal experience in your educational journey. So this is, inspired by the readings. You don't have to reference the readings in this essay. You definitely can, and we'll talk next week about moves and where you can do that. Future essays, you definitely will have to use like quotes, paraphrases, but those are skills that we're going to work on later on. For this one, I just really want you to think about what's important to you. Like this essay, it's always easy to be able to write about yourself, about experiences that you know very well, because we have a lot to say about those things, right? But then also this essay gives me the opportunity too to get to know some things about you, and then really kind of focus on essay structure and focus on developing out body paragraphs. So I just saw the question, can you email a rough draft and we can to your peer to review it? Absolutely, right? And I think that's really important when we're face to face. We actually have peer reviews. I tried it online, it was a little bit tough, but yeah, if there's somebody in the class that you work with and you want to kind of read each other's essays, I think it's tremendously important. When we're face to face in class, I always make time for you to do that with each other, because I think that like we learn as much from other people in the class as we do from an instructor in the class, right? Like this is a community and we're all learning and developing together. And so that's why, discussion posts, things like that are so important because we can help build off of each other's ideas and give each other really helpful feedback.
Yeah,
So
I was gonna
yeah,
address
go ahead,
that
Chris.
too. And if you want to send me anything as well, like that's awesome for me to look over stuff. I think that's a great tool for Zoom as well, so I can give you that like direct feedback as we're like reading through stuff. I think it's a really good tool for that.
Yeah, Zoom's really helpful for that. And we can always give, like Chris and I can give some quick feedback through email, right? Like
Yeah.
if there's like a section you say, hey, I'm writing this thesis, what do you think? Or working on this intro or body paragraph, whatever. We're definitely able to give pretty quick feedback through email, but really like it's really helpful to be able to talk through that feedback and look at
Hmm.
specific examples. And so one of the things that I would really encourage, even if you like email us or appear a copy of a draft of your paper, is being able to have the opportunity to meet and be able to talk through it with each other, right? So if we can meet on Zoom, that would be great too. So for this essay, your directions, you're just going to be picking 3 or 4 items that symbolize who you are as a student or what motivates you to pursue an education, right? So these artifacts can be something that are physical, right? Like maybe you have, I don't know, a picture that's meaningful for you. Um, that can be one of those things. Like, I don't know, maybe a picture of one of your children or a family member or whatever the case, right? Like sometimes pictures can be really, really motivating. Sometimes it can be maybe like people are motivated by like an award that they won, right? Like um, I've had a lot of people talk about like how they're motivated by different awards from like sports when they were in high school or academic rewards or certificates or motivated by diplomas or things like that, right? It could also be maybe you're motivated by like maybe somebody wrote you a letter, maybe it was an email, maybe it was something like an instrument. Like for me that was tremendously important. Like you know I kind of dropped out of high school, but I was able to graduate late. But the only reason that I didn't like fully drop out was because I was in band. And that was the only thing that really kind of like kept me wanting to go to school. Right. And so for me, it was like just that idea of a musical instrument was like, I don't quite know where I would have ended up had I have not had that thing to push me through school. Right. Maybe it's a person who motivates you. Right. And you could just write about that person and in one of your body paragraphs. Like, I could write about my dad. Like my dad, I shared a little bit in one of the discussion posts about my dad immigrated to this country when he was a teenager, but before, like, his family had like some difficult experiences with like my grandmother getting sick when he was young, and he finished a 3rd grade education. And so, like, he's always stressed the importance of school for me. And sometimes I listened to that advice and sometimes I didn't, right? And so I would say like that he was a massive motivating factor for me continuing school, graduating college, right? Like pursuing graduate school, things like that. So I think about people that are important to you, items that are important to you. You can also select something that's not physical, right? Like it could be a memory, right? Like a memory can be really motivating. Like I have memories of being in English classes with teachers who were great, and I have memories of being in classes with teachers who weren't great, that made me feel small, that made me feel like I wasn't capable of accomplishing my goals, right? And so I could use those memories of saying like this
Shut the
motivates
fuck
me to
up.
go through school.
I
What's that?
don't care. I don't care.
Watch this. Mute. There we go.
So I kind of have a question. So
Absolutely.
you were saying maybe using memories that like aren't so great. So like I wasn't sure about like, I don't know, like one of my memories is like I feel like it's like I want to be better out of spite.
Mhm.
Almost like, because of that teacher making me feel small. So like we can use something like that. It doesn't have to be like things that are like, oh, this motivates me because it was such a great experience. Like, can it be kind of like the opposite? Like you want to do better because, you don't want to like, I guess, not live up or live down to like that expectation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, do other people have those experiences where you feel like something like spite motivates you or wanting to like prove people wrong motivates you? I mean,
Like
Yeah.
someone shared
I
in the
think
chat that she does as well. So
yeah. I
I
mean,
think
I
I think
think
that's
we're
a I think that's a great artifact to talk about because it's still like a piece of your life that's motivating you in that direction.
Yeah, I had an English teacher in high school that basically told me that I couldn't read a book because I wasn't smart enough. But
Right.
then I ended up going and getting switched into the AP class because my mom was like, so like, that kind of thing where it's like, as a teacher, you tell a student they're not smart enough. And that's why I was like, you know what, I'm going to go into the AP class. I'm going to pass this AP class because I am smart enough type of thing.
Yeah,
So I just was
absolutely.
curious.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of people have had the same. I see a couple of people in chat saying the same thing, right? I mean, I can remember the teacher. It was like my junior year of English. Like I had a teacher named Miss Blythe, and I remember that experience. And now I'm like, if I ever ran across her and I'd have a conversation with her, I wouldn't like accost her or anything like that, but like I would be like, hey, yeah, I went to school and now I teach English and I do blah blah blah. But it would be like very much so of like you didn't win kind of experience. And I had a very similar experience to the one that you're describing. So I think it can be positive, it can be negative, right? It can be somewhere in between. And your paper could have a mix of both of those. You could talk about how one thing was tremendously important for you, and you could talk about like how great it was. And you can also talk about like, here's this other thing, equally as much of a motivator, but could have been a negative experience, right? And so like for me, like not graduating high school, the first time that I got to walk was when I earned my bachelor's degree. So I have to talk about what it felt like to not graduate high school. That life experience is a tremendously powerful motivator for me to go to school. So I would say like, so now as you're here students at Solano, like what's driving you? Positive experiences, negative experiences, a mix of both, totally up to you. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at next week as we develop our body paragraphs, how we expand on those ideas, right? And how we build on those. So for this essay, here's the criteria for success. I'm going to go over these next week because today we're only going to be working on developing the introduction. But the big thing that we're going to do is talk about how we build introductions to pull our readers into our papers and prepare our readers for the ideas that we're going to be presenting in our essay. Yeah, I think, I asked if the artifact can be imaginary. I think so, yeah. I mean, I think it would maybe be like imagining, can you give me a little bit of like idea what you mean by that, Gabriel?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Say nothing motivates me to go to school. I just felt like it, right? And then something that I could imagine seeing myself maybe in the future or whatever thing. And well, you could say that could be a motivation, but again, it wouldn't matter if you achieve it or not, that kind of thing. Well,
Yeah.
it's just, yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be perfect, right? Like, I think a lot of times we imagine like whether we're visualizing ourselves like graduating or visualizing a career that we want, or I mean, whatever, right? Like that could work really well. Like I've seen people talk about like imagining like a home that they want to own, or imagining a job that they want, or picturing themselves graduating. So absolutely, I think we do that all the time. We imagine, we kind of see that finish line before we're there, right? And visualizing that finish line is a really powerful source of motivation. So I think it'd be great. It's really open to you because what motivates one person can be very different, and maybe you want to do a mix of different things, right? Like one thing is tangible, one thing's a person, one thing's imaginary. Totally up to you. The important thing is whatever you pick, it's something that you care about, right? It's something that you have a lot to say about, because this is a pretty open essay, and so really kind of write about what matters to you and what's important to you. Okay, so let's take a look at putting intros together. Here, present. Oh, I need to go. Sorry, I'm just getting my share going here. Let's see. Now I should be able to go full screen. Sorry, sometimes it. Okay, you can see this now, right? Developing an introduction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, what do you already know about intro paragraphs? What are some things that people know about putting together an intro paragraph?
They're supposed to kind of give an overview of what you're going to talk about in your paper, like just kind of like a short synopsis.
Good. Yeah, that word synopsis. That's awesome. What is a synopsis?
Like when you read the back of a book, it gives a synopsis of the book.
Exactly.
When you watch a trailer of a movie, it gives a synopsis of the movie.
Yeah, That's perfect, right? You're scrolling through Netflix and it says like, here's a quick little couple sentences about what something's about. Right, good. What else do we know about introductions? What's something either an introduction has or what you think an introduction is, parts of an introduction? What are some other ideas?
Sorry, I'm just going to go again because I really hate when people don't respond in Zoom. My mom's a teacher
Okay.
and she does online Zoom, so that's one of her biggest pet peeves. Another thing an intro paragraph has, depending on, I think, what the topic is like a thesis statement.
Sure, right. Thesis absolutely can be part of that intro, right? And that's typically where we find it. See something coming up in the chat. Oops. A reference about what the book is. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good, right? A hook to grab your reader's attention. Awesome, right? So these are all great strategies of things that which you would have an introduction or kind of like strategies of introducing ideas to a reader. So,
okay,
yeah.
that's fine. So I was just gonna chip in real quick.
Sure.
For the intro paragraph, you probably want to make your position known on the subject. That's pretty much what you want to put in your intro paragraph, and then you can talk about the details later in the body of the essay.
Perfect. Yeah, know your stance, right? Let your reader know what your perspective is on a topic. That's great. And the introduction, good. Sequoia, like what you're going to be writing about. Like that's it. I mean, so this is everything that you're all breaking down is exactly what you should be doing in an intro. So this semester, we're really going to be focusing on this idea of like, there's no kind of one way of doing something, right? Like, I'm going to show you some suggestions on what structures I think are helpful, but it doesn't mean that it's the only way to structure an introduction or to structure an essay, right? Like there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of variety in what paragraphs look like. There's a lot of variety in different style, how introduction works. And so I'm showing you some varieties this semester, but it doesn't mean that the way that I show it to you is like the way of writing it or the way that you have to write it, right? And so instead, I like to kind of think about, again, like here are the different pieces that an introduction can have. And here's a strategy that I think is really helpful for writing an introduction. But later on, if you tweak that around and change it to a way it suits you and still does the same job, that's fantastic, right? So an introduction, you want to hook the reader, you want to grab their attention, right? Pull the reader into the paper. And we'll talk about some strategies of how to do that. Like you also want to think that like your intro is your first impression. And I think first impressions when it comes to writing are probably as important as first impressions in any other context, right? Like, it was kind of one of the things of like any situation where like I think about like what is like a good first impression, whether you're like sitting in a job interview or you're meeting somebody or you're writing something or whatever the case is, like that stands out quite a bit. And so whenever I read papers for this class, like, of course, I can read a paper that has like a little bit of a rocky introduction, but it's a fantastic paper and it can still get an A, right? But sometimes when we read papers in the very beginning, if an instructor is reading through a paper or a peer or whoever's reading through a paper, there's that thing in the very beginning where you're like, whoa, like you grab the attention, like you're like, yeah, this paper is awesome, right? Think about like movies start really, really strong and you're like, I'm in, right? Like you have my attention. And even if the rest of the movie is maybe not quite as good, you started off on such a strong note that you're like, it's much easier for you to like really sink into that. So I think a first impression is super important in putting a strong intro together. It gives the reader context, right? So like context is just, you want to give the reader some understanding. And so when we think about this first essay, it's really important to think about with this educational artifact essay is that like, you might need to, and I'll talk about this in a minute, like explain some key terms to your reader. Maybe, talk a little bit about like why you're in school right now, introduce the idea of educational artifacts, right? And kind of really get the reader prepared for ultimately your thesis, right? So your thesis is the argument of your essay. It's the central point of your essay. It's kind of, as Gabriel made that point, like it's what you're going to be focusing on as you're diving into the essay. So really, if we think about the job of the intro, pull the reader into the paper, kind of give that first impression, hook that person, give the reader the context that they need. Like think about context as like bringing somebody up to speed, right? Like here's what you need to know. Here's what you need to understand so that you can follow along with the rest of the essay. Any questions about like just kind of general overview of intro? So let's take a look then at, hooks. So different strategies for putting a hook together, and working on introductions and working on any of the things that we talk about early on in the semester is a recursive process, right? Meaning that we're coming back to it again and again and again throughout the semester. So just because we talk about intro today doesn't mean that we're not going to be focusing on intro 6 weeks from now, right? Doesn't mean that you're not going to be focusing. I teach introduction in English 2, English 4, right? I worked on developing introductions all through school, right? It's one of those things that, like, it's not like I learned intro and now I'm done, right? You're constantly working on it, developing it. So I don't want you to feel like it has to be mastered now because of this assignment. It's like, we're going to be talking about this later on and kind of how to fine tune some of these different pieces. So different strategies for putting together a hook. One of the things you can do is just start with a short narrative, right? And this can be really helpful. It can be a quick story. It can be something that's related to your essay that really pulls the reader in. Like, I think that just naturally, like, we're pretty like easily captivated by a good story, right? Like, if you're like that, it's like, oh, I've got a story to tell you. You're like, I'm in. Like, if one of my friends calls in the phone and be like, I have a story, you got to hear this. I'm like, tell me, right? Like, it hooks me. I'm interested right away. So for this essay, maybe one of the things, like a quick story you could talk about is like, your decision to start as a student Solano, or maybe thinking about, like, in that past experience that you had with, the teacher that wasn't motivating, you could talk a little bit about that. Give a few sentences about, like, what kind of, like, that visualization is for an end goal, right? So really this idea of something to hook the reader, and a story can be really helpful. Another thing that you could do is ask a question, right? Like, usually when we ask questions at the beginning of an essay, they're rhetorical. They're just meant to get the reader thinking, not really to have an answer. But if you're thinking about the topic, if you ask the question about, like, what motivates you, when things are difficult, or are there people in your lives that are really, drive you to be great, or whatever the case is, like, you're kind of really getting the reader to think about their own experiences, but also simultaneously, you're getting the reader to think about the topic that you're going to be exploring. So a question can be really helpful, right? Sorry, my dog wants to chime in. Another thing you can do, and we're going to talk about this more as we start using specific readings, but starting with a quote. It could be a quote from one of our essays, right? It could also be, one of the things that we read this semester. It could also be a quote that you found, right? Maybe there's a quote that means a lot to you. Maybe there's a quote that you researched that's related to the topic that you're focusing on. So really, it's totally up to you. But I think starting an essay with a quote can be a really helpful strategy to hook a reader and get their attention. And then the last thing to think about is, like, using some sort of fact or statistic. Later on, we're going to talk about this idea of rhetorical strategies later in the semester, and about how we can use appeals to emotion to, hang on a second, sorry, let me get after these dogs really quick. I think an Amazon truck pulled up, and my dogs, for some reason,
My dog
hate
is
Amazon.
like, what is going on?
I know. Sorry, hang on.
So I'll just add to what he was saying, that when you're starting your story and you can talk about, like, your own experience with a teacher or something like that, like we were saying earlier, that can totally be like a positive or a negative experience that you've gone through. You could start out with, like, I once had, like, the best teacher in the world, or you could start out with, like, man, I once had a teacher that was so bad I went to college. And it's like, well, okay, explain that to me. And that's your hook.
Chris, I was going to ask you, the
Yeah.
books that were referenced in Jose's presentation, were they the ones, are we supposed to read that before we write the essay, or what's the deal about that? This is my first class. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what was your question again? I missed part of it.
Sorry, the book that was actually referenced in the Jose's presentation, are we supposed to read those books before writing the essay for the class?
Oh, the ones we read last week?
Yes, I wasn't there, so I was a little.
Okay. I think they'd be pretty helpful, because they're just they're 2 stories, and they're only like a few pages, that are just about different experiences of how people got interested in their own education, basically. And kind of like the struggles that they had to go through and so forth. So I think they'd be useful just to give you an idea of, like, that kind of narrative. but it's not necessarily something that you're going to be that you need to use directly in your paper, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but they're
Thank you.
really short. It'll take you like a half hour maybe to read both of them.
All right.
Yeah,
Perfect. Thank you, Chris.
no problem.
Sorry, yeah, there's a delivery truck and these guys they don't like us getting packages. I think they want us back out at stores or something. I don't know what their problem is. So yeah, that was, any questions at all about putting hooks together? Different kind of strategies, right? Different ways that we can do that. The important thing is just like, try some of these different things, right? I mean, there's no right and wrong way to do it. It's just try any different way. Like think about, I think about like when I call like one of my friends on the phone, right? Like I think in the beginning, sometimes you just call just because, you know, you're bored and you just want to chat, right? And it's like, if you pick up the phone, you're like, hey, what are you doing? Nothing. What are you doing? Nothing. Right? I mean, it's like, you know, it might just like make for a conversation where you're like, all right, well, we're just going to chat. But if someone picked up the phone and they're like, dude, you're never going to guess what happened. You're like, oh, what? Or like, oh, I got to tell you what happened last night. Right? Like, I mean, there's just a way of like kind of hooking people right out of the gate. Like whether it's a movie trailer hooks you, or the beginning of a book hooks you, or a conversation hooks you, or, you know, a really good appetizer at a restaurant, like, which I miss going out to eat, right? Like when that kind of stuff hooks you, I think that like the important thing is like you're just grabbing somebody's attention and thinking like, here's some different ways that I can do it. These aren't the only ways, and we'll talk more about ways to do that throughout the semester and how to appeal to different things like people's emotions, their logic, their ethics, and we'll definitely fine tune that this semester. But just try to grab someone's attention and get them interested in your paper. All right, so next, let's talk a little about like building context. So your introduction should build context for your reader, right? Prepare your reader for the thesis. So that means that there's going to be, especially as we dive into some deeper topics and exploring using readings and things like that this semester, that there's going to be situations where your reader is going to need information to fully be able to understand your central argument, right? So like, for example, in this essay, you need to define key terms, right? And this is true of every essay. It's going to be becoming increasingly true. So I would say like, for example, this essay, your reader should know what an educational artifact is. Your reader should know a little bit about maybe like what your goals are in school, or, you know, what made you decide kind of generally to start college, right? Just enough so that when you get to the thesis statement, that the reader's like, okay, I'm on board. I understand like enough of these key ideas. Now let's imagine later on, you're writing an essay later in the semester and we're focusing on issues related to housing or issues related to education and social class, right? Like if your essay is going to focus on the impacts that gentrification has on a community, then you definitely want to make sure that you define that idea for your reader. If your essay is going to be focusing on upward mobility and the impact that socioeconomic status has on the quality of education people can receive, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you have some context there so the reader understands your perspective on where you're going before you hit them with the argument. So the point is like, you're just kind of getting the reader ready, giving the ideas that the reader knows or needs to know to be able to fully understand the thesis. I think about building context as like when you're not binge watching a TV show, but when you're watching a TV show like week by week, there'll be that thing at the very beginning where it's like last week on, and then you watch that last little bit, and then it's like, okay, cool. Now I remember, now it's time to start this new show. Or sometimes I have to do that when like a show disappears for a season. I come back, I watch like that YouTube, like 10-minute recap, like here's what's been happening on this show. And then I'm like, all right, I remember that. Now I'm ready to start watching it again. And so it's just kind of bringing your reader up to speed, right? That's all you really need to do. So think about what would your reader need to be able to understand to follow your thesis statement. And kind of a good practice is we want to pretend that our reader is somebody that's not necessarily in our class. They haven't read the same things that we've read. They haven't had the same conversations in the class that we've read. So really kind of a good way to think about it is like, could somebody in your family or could one of your friends or could, you know, a person in another class read this essay and still be able to follow along with those ideas, right? You should give them enough information to be able to do that. And that becomes increasingly important because when we get to the end of the semester and you are writing your research papers, that's going to be true of your audience, right? Like I will not have read the same things that you've read. You're researching a topic that you're choosing, you're finding your own readings, right? Like I'm helping with that process, but I'm not the person is saying, here's these different things to read that I've read before, right? You're going to have to bring me up to speed, bring Chris up to speed, bring peers in the class to speed with what the topics are that you're exploring. Oops. So how would you define thesis statement? What's a thesis statement in your own words? That's some idea of what a thesis is. Anyone want to take a shot at a definition of a thesis? I've heard it defined already multiple times with some of the earlier things that people said about what an intro is.
Is your thesis like your stance on something? So like if you're writing about, for example, you were saying like the socioeconomic impacts of like, you know, education and all that, it could be like where you stand on that position.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's your stance, right? It's your focus for your essay, right? It's what you're going to be arguing. And later on, like our thesis statements will become increasingly argumentative. And when I use argumentative in this essay, I don't mean like two people screaming at each other, right? Or you know, necessarily even disagreeing, but your argument could just be your stance, right? It could just be something of like, here's what I believe to be true. Here's the stance that I'm taking on this issue. And then through the rest of the essay, you're going to be supporting your argument, like backing it up, right? And we're going to talk next week when we build body paragraphs about how we back these ideas up. So really just kind of the easy way of thinking about putting a thesis together, is that your thesis is usually it's one well-developed sentence, right? It doesn't have to be, but usually a thesis is written in a sentence. A thesis is also usually located at the end of your introduction. Again, it doesn't have to be. Your thesis can be somewhere in the middle, something like that, but it makes a lot of sense to put it at the end of the intro, right? And I'll talk about in the next kind of section about how to kind of visualize the introduction. So the thesis is just the controlling idea of your essay, right? Like think about your thesis is in charge of your essay. Every idea that you present in your essay is there to support your thesis statement, right? It's there to back it up. It's evidence, it's support, right? That everything that you're writing is there because you need it to be able to fully support your thesis statement. Think about like controlling idea of like, I don't know, a recipe or what you're going to cook for dinner, right? So like tonight, what I'm going to cook for dinner, everything that I need to be able to cook, like that specific thing, if I take it out of the fridge, if I take it out of my pantry, if I take it out of the cupboard and I put it all out on the counter, the only things that belong there need to be there because they're part of that recipe. So if you were to be able to point to something, you would say like, what's that salt for? I'd be able to tell you. Why do you need thyme? Why do you need beef broth? Why do you need carrots? Whatever it is that I'm cooking, right? Usually my examples are very food motivated because like I'm kind of constantly in a state of being hungry, but like if I were to say like, why do you need this? I would say, I need this because it's part of this recipe for this, that, and the other. If all of a sudden you looked out on the counter and there were like, I don't know, chocolate chips, and you were to say like, well, what's this for? Does that go in the dinner recipe? And I'm like, no, those shouldn't be there. Think about the same way with ideas in your essay, right? Your thesis statement is like, this is what's for dinner. This is the controlling idea. This is the recipe that I'm cooking. Everything that's in your essay, you should be able to answer the question of how does this support your thesis statement? And the same way you would say, why is this out here for this thing that you're cooking? If you can't, then either the idea is not ready to be fully developed and you need to maybe kind of think about why that's there, or maybe it's off topic. Maybe I would say, oh, you know what, that doesn't belong there. I'm going to put that back away in the pantry. And we do that a lot with our ideas, right? And we'll talk about some strategies of outlining and kind of brainstorming this semester. But maybe one of the things is you're like, you know what, really, once I look at this idea, it really doesn't fit. I don't need it. I'm going to put it away, right? And so think about that idea of like, it's the controlling idea, and then every body paragraph in your essay is meant to develop and support the thesis in one way or another, right? Your thesis presents your central argument. It's the stance you're taking in your essay, and your reader, in a lot of cases, maybe not necessarily in this paper, but should be able to agree or argue against your thesis. That's how you know you have an effective thesis. It's like you can present an argument, whether I say like, you know, this is what I think is the best restaurant in Fairfield, or I say, you know, this is what I think is the best TV show ever created, right? Like when people make stances like that, even if it's something as simple as like, I hated the movie, that's a thesis statement, you can support that. A reader can agree with that, could disagree with that. You could prevent fully developed out ideas to support your claim. So think your thesis is a stance on an issue that you got to be ready to back up. So for this essay, what do we think a thesis might look like? What do you think a thesis sentence or statement would say for this essay? It's kind of generally, what should it do? Anyone have an idea?
So would the thesis present the reader with kind of a, how can I say this? So if I was doing my thesis, I might say, you know, because of my past life experiences, this is the reason that I have become the person that I am today, or the reason that I have become, you know, part of the class or on my educational journey.
Exactly. Right. So it's perfect, right? It's like whatever the reasons you picked, like in the chat, Kaja wrote the reason why we picked our artifacts, and you articulated the same thing, Carl. It's exactly right. It's just, here is, you know, these things, these sources of these artifacts or motivate me to pursue an education, have given me the drive to, it's like, you're basically saying like, general idea, here's this idea of artifacts, and I'm motivated through school by a number of different artifacts or things that drive me, or people, or whatever the case is, right? And some people might, maybe yours are 3 different people. Maybe somebody else's are 3 different experiences. Maybe somebody else's are a person experiencing a thing, right? However you generally want to package that, you're kind of just letting us know, like, and everyone's might look a little bit different. Like for me, I didn't start Solano until years after high school, right? And it was like, you know, these experiences in my life and these artifacts influenced me to make the decision to return to school after a pretty negative experience through high school, and gave to start school again, right? And then I would support, now I have to back it up. So whatever it looks like for you, this is kind of a nice example where a reader can't really argue against that. I can't be like, no, I don't believe that. That's not why Carl went to school, or no, that's wrong, right? Kaja, that's not an experience. So it's like, it's not the same as like they can disagree with it, but think about your reader is kind of sitting back, and now your reader is like, okay, well, prove it to me. Show me how important these things were for you and explain why. And next week, we're going to talk about that idea of like building body paragraphs with like clear evidence, examples, and analysis to be able to back it up.
Yeah, I think another good way to think about it is like, especially when you're writing an essay like you are now, where you're given an essay prompt, is thinking about your thesis as, what is my answer to that prompt? And it is a good way to direct yourself of thinking about like, what's the main idea that I'm getting at in this paper that I'm going to write my thesis about. So yeah, I think that's a great example.
And so this is kind of an easy way, just like a way that helps me visualize an introduction is, I think I had it explained when I was in English 1, the teacher that I had that I absolutely loved, it was like just like best English teacher I've ever had, explained it to me as a funnel, right? That like everything that goes into the funnel is exactly the same, right? Whatever liquid's being poured into a funnel is the same at the top as it is at the bottom. But where it gets to the bottom, it gets more specific, right? So it's not that the substance changes, it's that the way that it's being delivered changes. And I think that visually really helps me think about an introduction. And so think about the beginning, the top of the funnel is your hook, right? It's general, it's related, it's about the topic of the essay, it's about the focus of the essay, but its job is just to kind of like generally bring the reader into the paper, get the reader thinking about this idea, get the reader kind of like thinking about the points that might be brought up in the essay, and that's that general part. Throughout the introduction, as the things get more and more specific, just kind of like in this little middle section of the funnel where that arrow is, that's where you're building context for your reader. So your job is, you're getting more specific. You're maybe kind of talking about those experiences in school. Maybe you're introducing 1 or 2 of the artifacts, right? Like you're getting more and more specific in your ideas until finally that little bottom section of the funnel where the liquid's coming out, right? That's where it's the most specific. That's where it's the most concentrated. And so think about that as your thesis statement. Like we start in general, it goes down, 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 it gets more specific. You're kind of guiding the reader. And then right where you get to that tiny little outlet of the funnel, that's as specific as you're going to get in the introduction. Like, this is what I'm arguing in this essay, right? And then the rest of the essay, now it's going to come out to be able to back it up and to support those claims. So it's kind of like breakdown of introduction. Does anyone have any general questions about putting intros together, or anything about like kind of what we talked about or focused on?
At what point would you say like an introduction is starting to get a little bit too wordy and like diving too deep into what the actual paper is going to be about?
That's a really good question. And I always give like the least satisfying answers to these questions because it really depends on the situation. I would say, you know, like that question of like, how long does it need to be, or how long does that need to be? It really depends on the specific essay. I would say for this essay, because if we look back at like kind of the breakdown of how long this essay should be, at the max, I think this essay needs to be about 750 words, which is about 3 pages. You could get it done in 2.5, right? But I would say about 3 pages is probably a nice place for this first essay. And in that place, I would say your introduction, half a page, something like that. Where I think it gets to a way to kind of think about that's true of any situation, whether it's a longer essay, your research paper, you might be writing an introduction, it's 1.5 pages, 2 pages, right? Because you're really kind of giving a lot of context. So it's like, how much does that person that's reading the essay need to be prepared for the thesis statement? How much runway do you need, right? So if you think about that idea of like, I imagine if you think about like, I'm not an expert on flying airplanes, right? You know, despite what you all may think, but like, I imagine a little airplane needs much less room to be able to take off, right? Like than a big giant airplane does. And so if you think about that from the context of an essay that's kind of smaller in nature, that's maybe not kind of exploring something that's as big, like this educational artifact, like it doesn't take as much definition for the reader. You don't have to introduce different readings, right? So the runway doesn't need to be as big. If you're working on your research paper or our next essay where we have to introduce outside readings to the reader, get the reader kind of really thinking about your stance on an argument, we're talking about counter argument, you're going to need a little bit more runway. And so I would say, is this enough to get my reader up to speed? And for this essay to give you kind of like a definite answer, I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of like half a page would probably be okay. 1/3 of a page, probably no more than 3/4 of a page, somewhere right around that sweet spot sounds about right. I like to think a lot of things in writing about, like, again, going back to my food examples, think about like the right size bite of food, right? Like if it's too little, it's going to feel underwhelming. And I'll use that analogy again when we talk about how to select effective quotes for our essays. But if it's too much, it can be really overwhelming, right? So it's kind of like just enough, like just what that kind of right bite is. And it's hard to really define that other than like, you know it when you see it, or you know it when you take that bite of food, like I took too much or I took too little, right? And then in the chat, I got asked, are there any topics to avoid? That's a really good question. It's really up to you. You know, I think that one of the things when it comes to this class, like you're never going to be asked to share anything or to write about anything that you don't want to write about. But I also think that there are moments in writing where, and it's really all about what you feel comfortable with. You know, usually the essays, unless you're doing some kind of like sharing an essay with somebody in the class or writing something in a discussion post, if you write an essay, the only will read it is me, and then Chris could possibly be reading it too. But if it's turned in as an assignment, not as a discussion post, it just goes directly to me. Nobody else in the class can read your essays unless you choose to share them with people in the class. So I think there are moments where, like, when you think about topics that you might want to avoid, there will be times when I'm asking follow-up questions where I'm not trying to like pry in your personal business, but instead the ideas need to be explored, because whether you are writing about something that's very personal to you or not, you still need to have developed examples, right? So I think that it's really not about what topics you should avoid, but like sometimes we're motivated by things that are like, you know, incredibly personal. We're motivated by things that you know might be hard to write about, right? There are some really powerful things that happen when we explore some of those different ideas, just as you're going to see in some of the things that we read, right? And some of the things that we'll read this semester. But also know that if you bring up a topic in a paper, that you're going to have to be okay with giving a developed example, right? So if I were to say like, well, how did that make you feel, or what happened, or be specific here, I'm not trying to pry into your personal business, but to have a well-developed essay, you have to know that like you have to be okay with exploring that idea and diving into some examples and some details about that. So really, whatever you feel comfortable with. There's really nothing to avoid. It's just about like, do I want to kind of go there in this essay, or do I not? And really, you're the only person that can answer that. And so if you ever just, you know, want to talk about things like that, again, I'll be the one reading your essay. And even when we're doing like peer review and stuff like that, or excuse me, like kind of just I'm helping review essays with you and we're working together. Right now during mini lessons, there's multiple people in here, but when we meet in office hours, I have it set up where I can just kind of let people in or move people from room to room, things like that. So if there's ever a time where you're writing about something that's personal, we can just be meeting the two of us, right? Or you can meet with just me and Chris, or however you want to do it. And you don't have to feel like everybody in the class is reading those ideas. Discussion posts, those are open. Everyone can see those. Assignments you turn in, essays you turn in, not everyone can read those. Any other questions at all? Cool. So I will post a recording of this, right? So you'll all have access to this. Later on, it'll be under the announcements later today. It just takes a little while for it to upload to YouTube and get some captions on it and stuff like that. And then as you're working, if you have any questions at all this week, please let me know, like when you're working on your introduction. I'm still going to be here. I have an office hour running for another hour. So if you want to hang out and ask some questions or have some specific things that you want us to look at with talking through your introduction, totally happy to do that. And then same thing, if you want to meet later this week, tomorrow, anything like that, just let us know and we can talk through that.